Okay, going to give everyone a moment to join. All right, well, hi everyone, and welcome to the Marketplace Risk Virtual Event Series. My name is Andrea, and I'm the Director of Events and Logistics here at Marketplace Risk. Along with Unit 21, we'd like to welcome Abhay and Antony from Thumbtack and Stephanie Horowitz from Wonolo. Our virtual events are designed to help marketplace and sharing economy startups successfully navigate complex risk management, trust and safety, compliance, and legal subject matter, so they can avoid distractions in order to focus on launching and growing. Be sure to check out marketplacerisk.com to access hundreds of hours of content, including our master's program, platform podcast, and previous live events. And to subscribe to our newsletter where we keep you up to date on everything, including the upcoming Sharing Economy Global Summit in London. Thank you everyone for tuning into today's session. A couple housekeeping items. First, all attendees have listening capabilities only and are otherwise muted. And second, please submit your questions via the control panel. If we have time at the end, we'll answer as many as we can. If we don't get to your questions, feel free to email us at info@marketplacerisk.com. We'll get your questions answered. And now, without further ado, presenters, over to you.
Hey everyone, I'm Priya from Unit 21. Really good to be here today and excited to host this webinar with Abhay and Stephanie. Some background on Unit 21, we are a platform that helps detect and investigate suspicious activity through a no-code rules engine and an investigation dashboard. So that's a bit about me. I'll turn it over to Stephanie.
Thanks, Priya. Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie Horowitz, and I am the Senior Manager of Trust and Safety at Wonolo. Before I was working for Wonolo, I was working at Lyft, where I also was working in the safety space. And then prior to that, I was specializing in trust and safety at Eventbrite. So all in, I've had about 10 years or so of specialization in the trust and safety industry. And we'll throw it over to Abhay.
Hey everyone, my name is Abhay Antony. Currently, I'm the head of trust and safety at Thumbtack. I'm the head of trust and safety, proactive and policy. I lead the proactive mitigation as well as the policy teams here. And then in all of my experience in the trust and safety space, I've worked at like 4 companies in this domain. I worked at social media at Facebook. I worked at Uber in the safety domain, as well as a product manager in the Asia market. I've had about like 8 years of experience in the domain.
Awesome. Well, why don't we go ahead and, oh, Andrea, go ahead.
I apologize, carry on.
All good. Yeah, why don't we go ahead and get started. Thanks for both of you for doing some intros. I think it would be helpful to just start and learn a little bit more about both your roles, your companies, and then maybe size structure of your trust and safety teams and practices today.
So I could start. So Priya, you want me to talk a little bit more about like the role I'm in now and the companies I've worked with? Okay. Yeah, I mentioned that I have worked at Eventbrite, Lyft, and now Wonolo in the trust and safety space. I started specializing in trust and safety while I was working at Eventbrite, which was probably about 10 or so years ago. And at the time, that team was very small, and so we were just starting to get into the trust and safety space. And then in 2014, I went over to Lyft, and they were pretty new in the industry as well, and were trying to build out more of a team. And so I was one of the first specialists that they hired that had some trust and safety experience. And so I worked there for 7 years, kind of building out the team, focusing a lot on policy and kind of how you want to handle safety incidents on the platform. And then yeah, just in 2021, I moved over to Wonolo, and so I've been focusing with our trust and safety team, which is very small here, but has been established. And I also lead our background check operations team, which focus on compliance screenings. And And that team is also pretty small, but we're pretty mighty as well. But yeah, I don't know if there's, Priya, was there anything else you wanted me to touch on?
Oh, no, not at all.
Okay.
Abhay, if you wanted to add anything, or we could dive into questions.
Yeah, I mean, I can share a brief overview of Thumbtack. Thumbtack is a marketplace where you can find pros to do like home care tasks for you. So if you're in need of a plumber, electrician, handyman, or like a contractor in the US market, like Thumbtack's the place to be to find those pros. Essentially, like the trust and safety team at Thumbtack is fairly old. Like it was established 8 years ago. So it was created pretty early on in the founding journey. And then the team I lead is basically like the risk analytics team, the payments risk team, as well as the operations and policy teams that set some of the policies and create the processes to manage trust and safety incidents.
Awesome. And I guess, how did you guys know, when the right time was to actually build a dedicated trust and safety team? Maybe Stephanie, we can start with you.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, both Wonolo and Lyft already had their trust and safety teams starting to get established. But while I was working out of Eventbrite, I started working there as a customer support associate, and we did notice that we started to have specific cases that I think there was a need to specialize. And so I think a few factors that it's important to consider is, in terms of whether it's want to have a dedicated team or not, was the volume of the types of the issues that we wanted the team to specialize in, like how often were we getting those, how complex were these issues, were they taking a lot of time, was it too hard to try and have just your support function owning these, and then were you able to build out like a dedicated process to it, or were you relying on a team member who had that experience to be able to have the autonomy to make those decisions? Because I think, as we know in the trust and safety space, a lot of the times the issues that we're presented with don't have an exact workflow to go through, and you kind of have to develop it case by case depending on what the situation is. And then I think another thing to consider was, what is the impact on those types of issues to be resolved correctly? Meaning, are they very painful for your customers? Could it create like a churn situation, or is this something that could impact the brand if not handled appropriately? Are there compliance things to consider? And I think all that together, you start to realize that you really need to have a team, or at least a couple people dedicated, so that they can start to get the skills and understand what these issues are. And then once you have those people in that space, and I was very lucky to be in that space at the time at Eventbrite, you get to start to understand how you can explain and train others, and try and put a roadmap or at least some workflows together to resolve these issues. While it's unlikely you're going to get the same issue every single time, the themes are going to be similar in terms of what you're trying to resolve. And so, I think it's important to make sure that you're handling them specifically, handling the case specifically to what that customer is saying and what the details are associated with that. You can get a workflow together to at least guide team members so you can hopefully solve those at scale. So those are just, I think, some things to think about. And that was a lot of what we thought about when we were trying to understand if we needed a dedicated team, and how many people we might need on that team.
Yeah, from my side, like every time I join like a new company in the trust and safety domain, like every time I try to find like the oldest employee in the room and then ask them like what was their founding story. Every time I do ask the question, it's almost the same kind of like steps in every company. Like they usually like have trust and safety issues before they have a trust and safety team. That is like one theme I've noticed like across the board. And it's usually the customer service teams who kind of like take on the first trust and safety issue with the legal teams help. So it's usually, that's the usual founding story. That it's always like there's no dedicated person to trust and safety. There's a trust and safety issue. You try solving it, and when like the number of issues increase, like hopefully like your company scales, and then you reach a point where you probably need a full-time headcount just doing these issues, or you need like a lot of a lot of specialized skill to be able to manage these issues. I think that's the time, like, I think companies should make a decision that, hey, like, should we specialize one person in trust and safety issues? And then from there on, it's a matter of like growing the team, finding your needs. I think Stephanie hit the right points in terms of like, what is the dent to your brand if you don't solve trust and safety? And right now, I think like a lot of issues come through like social media teams as well. I think that was not the case probably like when I started, but now almost like most of the reputational damage, like people will like post on social media. The social media teams essentially like respond to them and they realize, hey, like there's something that happened with the trust and safety element that like someone needs to look at. I think it's always the founding story that it comes from either like customer support teams or now more recently social media teams. But then the initial trust and safety teams itself are usually like someone in legal, someone doing support, like someone in PR, are like the usual kind of like first few members like coming in. And as the team grows, obviously you need to find like the right like product partners to build your tech stack, like how will you manage it once you scale. And then from there on is like finding the right tools to manage scale. And then like I think the more advanced version of like trust and safety teams always rely on specialization, where there's a specialized policy team, there's a specialized operations team, there's a specialized like team doing like proactive risk mitigation. Then you get like full-time analysts. So it's like I think the founding journey has been like consistent across all the companies I've worked in, which I think is a good playbook for a company which does not have a trust and safety team to start on.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for sharing. And Abhay, I don't know if you wanted to speak and a little bit more to how that's differed at Thumbtack and then also bigger companies that you've been at in the past, like Uber and Facebook.
So from my experience, like, and then these are like stories I've heard from my boss. My boss has been with Thumbtack for 8 years, so he was one of the first people who joined the trust and safety side. It's always a diverse team, right? So he came in from a legal, profession where it was like leading paralegal. So it's always a very diverse team that forms initially, and then we kept hiring internally. We kept hiring people from like customer support who already kind of like knew these issues, and then as the team grew, I think we built like a good like social media team. We built like a good team to support incidents, and then at scale we're at right now, we have a team of really good risk analysts who can both like proactively look at issues, like find issues before they become incidents, and then also like create rules to keep the platform safe. So I think like right now we're at a mature stage of a trust and safety practice. What I've heard, and then like again, like these are just like stories which like the more tenure, like the people who are like with the founding team kind of like share with you when you work at like the companies I worked in the past. I think in social media, it was a similar story. Essentially it was customer support, and like social media, like Facebook at that time like didn't have like customer support. They essentially, the first few people like just reading emails coming in sort of like saw that, hey, like there's a need to do moderation. I think like between marketplaces and social media companies, I think like if you look at the public reports as well, it's a lot more to do with content moderation, whereas for marketplaces, it might be more to do with physical safety. So the mix of teams you build like depends on the market you're in. So you might need like more like law enforcement teams. You might need like liaising teams between the two, and that's sort of like how it goes. And then, as I said, I think like everyone's stack is a little different than the other person, and then it's usually just based on like what happens. So like if there's an incident, you'll create a team to handle that incident, and then from there on, like that becomes your playbook the next time you see it.
Yeah, I was going to add to that, Abhay. I know you mentioned this earlier, but I think a really good point about having trust and safety teams and how diverse they are is Abhay was saying when we were talking earlier that, there really isn't like a major or some school you can go to for trust and safety. It's kind of a newish industry. I know when I was starting there, it seemed like it was really new. There were some teams starting up that seemed like trust and safety because this gig economy space needed it, but it was definitely really like a new concept. And so the diversity of teams is super interesting. Like I think about the teams that I've hired, and there's really no one like size fits all to what you should look for. And so I think to Abhay's point, you want to figure out like what are the themes of the incidents or the cases or whatever the work you want this team to be doing. What is that type of work, and are there like similar themes, and try and reach out to people who either have previous experience. And I definitely agree, like customer support is a really great area to tap into because they have so many skills. They know about the product, they know about the type of user issues, and it's very complementary. But it can kind of, people can succeed in these roles from all different types of backgrounds. I mean, I remember working and hiring some people who previously were bartenders, and they had such amazing good skills about talking with people and being able to understand and connect with individuals when it really matters. And I think that's it's just a really interesting market to get into, and to see the types of people that excel. Like there's no particular background that makes sense for everyone. I think typically legal, like Abhay said, maybe law enforcement, or people have experience in some of these very like complex areas that do require investigation tend to do well. But you also want to think about like what's the type of experience you want to provide. And so I think it's important, is usually a lot of these people are working with customers who have experienced some sort of negative interaction with the company usually, and that's why it's a trust and safety issue. And so I think it's really important to think about how you're stacking a team and make sure that you have people who are dedicated to making things right if they can.
Absolutely. Especially in industry events, like every time you go to like say something like the Marketplace Risk Conference, like the diversity of people you meet there, like every person is from a different industry, from a different field. You really don't know, like you really can't even imagine like what this person's like background is like. Like like the last time I was in SF, met people who were like from like I think legal, engineering, product, operations, but also people who've done like who did their like maybe masters in like government policy are now doing like policy work for trust and safety teams. It's really like it is one of the most diverse teams in any company I worked in. So I think that's a key strength. I think in trust and safety teams, it's better to hire for complementing skill set instead of hiring more of like one kind of template.
100% agree.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And I guess, when you think about like beyond hiring, sort of building that team out, building that entire process, maybe could you guys speak to what level of internal buy-in you needed, how you navigated that process, and maybe challenges that came up along the way?
I'll let Abhay start with this one.
Absolutely. And then this has been a journey all through, right? Like irrespective of like which point of maturity of a trust and safety team you join in, there'll always be improvements to be made. There'll always be teams to grow, like more risks added as your like product or company grows. I think the buying piece is like really, really important. I think creating this really solid case for what is the ROI on every dollar invested on trust and safety teams becomes really important. I think research teams like have been like a really good help in the past. I think the customers, like if you're a customer facing marketplace, the customers and like both sides of the marketplace will essentially call this out in their top 3 needs. Like they want a safe marketplace, a safe platform to engage with. So research teams have always been like a good kind of like first layer of like source material to say that, hey, this is important to our customers. I think the second bit is like using analytics to actually measure like how much of an issue this is. I think using and on the legal side, I think the biggest cost to a trust and safety issue is like usually litigation, is usually like the large settlements that like you can't really predict. I think one way to do it is instead of like learning it by your own mistakes, I think like everyone should learn from others' mistakes. I think like whichever industry you're in, if there is a dominant player, if there's like similar industries, you can always like search for news articles. You can like ask your legal team to search for like public settlements to figure out like what is the worst case scenario, right? And modeling out worst case scenarios and figure out like how much percent, like are we like, is there a 10% chance like we hit the worst case scenario? Is also a good way to kind of like model the total risk. And the second bit is in the social media world that we're living in, like reputational risk is high. Like a bad experience can be viral. Like it can kind of like yeah, a lot of people can hear about. So modeling that in with your PR team, I think, is really important. Like working with your social media and PR teams to say that, hey, like if something like this happens and we don't have a team to support it, like what do you think would be the hit on the brand? So I think like the final mix you get in terms of like total cost if you don't do this is essentially like the litigation cost, the cost of like the operations itself, plus like the brand damage, and then that kind of like all of it together, like that's the cost you want to mitigate. So that's when you say that, hey, like the return on investment on funding this team it'll pay for itself because of the risks you're mitigating. I feel that's worked out. I think at Thumbtack, like they're very, very proactive in terms of being like leaders in this space. The team themselves is like really tenured, and then like we've been able to like retain as well as hire new talent. So I feel that's the right mix to both like grow your teams. I think from a systems perspective, um, just as I said, like the origin story is usually from customer support. So essentially the first trust and safety teams always inherit whatever systems you get in like customer support. So like if you're in like a ticketing system, you kind of like inherit whatever customer support is using. And then from that point on, I think like every company needs to figure out like what is the scale they want to operate in. So as the company grows, like probably the things that customer support does, like probably SLAs are not the same. You find out like there are like some more critical incidents you might need to manage like really fast, and that's where you kind of have to put in some thought leadership with like product partners to figure out like what is the right stack for a trust and safety team, if not the current one. So it is an evolutionary journey. I think some teams benefit if they start out with like specific like trust and safety providers, because as the product kind of like grows in trust and safety, you can like grow along with it. So that's a good recipe for success. But I think like that's kind of like my take on how it grows. It's always evolutionary. Like there won't be like a big step change. It's always one step at a time.
Yeah, I agree with everything said. I really like the piece about modeling, especially now when there is a lot of media coverage regarding companies and incidents that could happen, whether that's fraud or something else that could take place. Like it's easy to be able to do some research and see like, hey, what was the response here? And then, to work with your teams to figure out like, hey, this isn't a real life situation that happened. Like, how would we resolve this right now? Right now, we're not staffed to it. Here's my proposal. And I think similar to what Abhay said, for trust and safety, there's going to be some natural, I think, stakeholders that will be advocates for this as well that you can get on your side. Legal is a good one. Finance, because I think there is a cost perspective, as Abhay was saying, in terms of reducing costs or risk to the company if we are able to handle certain issues correctly and resolve them with the care that they need. I think definitely like comms or a PR team can get on board, and I think and to Abhay's point, it definitely will evolve. Like but the stakeholders are there, and I think the first thing is to understand is like how can we kind of make sure that we get alignment from them to let them know like, hey, we're here to help you. Here's what the plan is, and then they will help champion the solution as well. I think it's also good to look at what are some of the issues that are being presented that we want the team to focus on, and who are those who primarily is being impacted by those issues and how. And so especially with double-sided marketplaces, usually there's two kind of customers in different groups, and sometimes it might be that one set of those customers may be disproportionately impacted by some issues, and others it could be like your whole user base could potentially have a trust and safety issue. That's usually the case too. And so find out like what are who kind of owns some of those teams, and work early on to get them on your side, especially if you're asking for money or engineering resources. Those are usually very scarce, especially at startups. And when it comes to engineering resources, a lot of time it's really challenging to get engineers on your side before you have issues, because it's hard to demonstrate to them like, hey, these things happen and this is why we need to get in front of this. And so as long as you could get more people in the company to really champion that, and then do the modeling, as Abhay said, or show some of the real-time situations where you've had either customers churn or you've had issues that arise, I think that it's easier to get people on your side as earlier as possible and show them that like, hey, we're working on this together. They might not be included on every decision that's made, but it's much easier to bring them in ahead of time than try and do it after the fact, where they might not be as open to collaborating if they feel like they don't understand like what the team's focus is, or if the team is going to take work away from a team that was previously handling it. So that's the only thing I would add, is just identifying the stakeholders as early as possible and trying to collaborate with them so they are just as invested in the mission and can champion that if you're asking for more resources.
I think Stephanie brought a really interesting point, like that the buy-in is not like the first buy-in to get the team, like what I've learned like from all of my managers in the past, and like all the good managers, like buy-in is continuous. It is a process. People change, priorities change. Like what happened last year is not what will happen like next year, and like probably not the same people either. So buy-in is always this continuous process of educating new leaders, new product leaders, engineering leaders, like whoever is new to the company, on like what the benefits are, like what are we doing, and like why are we doing it. And I think that continuous education kind of like helps teams grow, and not like go the other way. So I think like that was a good learning like early on in my career, that like the buy-in should be like a continuous and like everlasting thing. It just never ends.
Absolutely. And I guess when you're, once you've actually sort of educated customers, internal stakeholders a bit more, and you have more of an established team, how did you both think of measuring success? Were there certain metrics that you were tracking? Abhay, maybe.
Yeah.
Or Stephanie, yeah, go for it.
I'll start, but definitely want to hear from Abhay as well on this, so I'll be quick. But I think, Abhay kind of touched on this earlier when it comes to like what are the traditional types of measurements that you might use for teams, especially customer-facing teams. SLAs, customer effort score, NPS. Those might not be exactly like apples to apples when it comes to measuring success for a trust and safety team. Typically, these issues may be more complex. They might take a lot more time to solve. And so looking at total SLA, like if you don't have the team stack, that might not look as great if you're mapping from like total resolution time, or that's included with SLAs. And same with customer effort score. It might not be enough to just say, or to survey somebody at the end of a trust and safety issue and ask them a question that's more geared towards NPS, or like, hey, were you delighted by the service? Depending on the types of issues that you're handling, that might not sound as great to the person who maybe had just reported that, depending on what happened. And so I think there's like a couple things you could think about. I would think about, what is the result you're looking to drive with this team? Is it a spend? Are you trying to reduce spend because you're spending a lot of money, paying people out for fraud issues that, negatively impacted them? Or maybe you're looking to drive improvements with just the reliability score, like the trust of your brand. Maybe there's like compliance requirements. And so looking at all of that, I would think, what's like the one top goal that you guys are wanting this team to achieve? And then try and be creative about how you can measure that. So even though if there's like a traditional customer effort score survey you're sending, or a traditional other survey, maybe look at like, hey, is there another survey that we could create that's maybe more catered to the trust and safety use case, and we can send that out to customers when we know the issue is really done and they're not still investigating it, or they're not still waiting for a response from somebody. And then I think, QA score as well would be really interesting. And I know not all teams have a dedicated QA team, but if there is like a measurement in terms of, hey, it's really important that we respond to these issues correctly, there's a compliance component associated with that, making sure that you have a team that's staffed to really QA the results from the actual work that the team is doing, and you can measure like their compliance toward the process. And then I would also think like, how do you track cost and spend? And that's, that tends to get people's ears perked up the most, is like, how much money are we saving, or how much are we bringing in if we're actually able to secure a customer because we resolved an issue. And so there's a lot of ways that you could track that, but I would try and think a little bit outside the box in terms of what the traditional metrics are. And maybe if you're just starting a trust and safety team, focus on, maybe one goal that you're trying to hit, which is maybe that every trust and safety tagged case gets responded to within an hour. That might be a little ambitious, especially for teams that aren't 24/7, but that's something that it's usually really important to react and respond very quickly. And that's something very tangible to measure and see if there's an impact from that. But I'll stop rambling and ask Abhay to share his thoughts as well.
I think like Stephanie hit like all the right points for like incident management operations. I think she covered like almost all KPIs like most companies deal with. I think I can complement that with the proactive mitigation word. I would say I say like I always do two things. Like whenever you make a case for a trust and safety team, you use metrics, and I'm always a big fan of like keeping those metrics as the team forms and tracks, because then you can kind of like fulfill the guarantee, right? Fulfill your obligation, or fulfill the dream that like, hey, like by investing in this, you'll get that. So keeping like the same KPIs or like keeping them consistent across time is always better. Repetition is key. I think like leadership takes time to warm up to KPIs. I would say like from a proactive world, there are some industry leaders in like both social media and marketplaces that really like that have created like public reports which have key KPIs. So if you like, I would say like every person in the trust and safety space should read the Uber safety reports. They're like super high quality. They're public. They launched their second safety report in June, and like really like all the amount of work and analytics that goes into making these reports, like make them a wealth of information in terms of what KPIs to track and how to do them. So they've really done a service to like the entire industry, because now there are standards in place that like other partners can look at, right? Similarly, in social media world, like Facebook has a transparency center where you can like drill down to each issue type and then see like what are they actually tracking on the top line. And then these are like all public reports. You can find them online. A quick Google search should lead you to those pages. And then always it's the top three, like I've always found, is like how prevalent is it? Like there's always like a prevalency or a total recall number that like always comes up in most of these reports. There's always I think the amount of like proactive protection, or like how much of them were we able to like stop before like someone reported it. And then there's always like the total number in terms of like what's the total scheme of things, like how many, like if you're doing like X posts, then like how many of those like X posts were like bad. If it's accounts, like you'll see like the Facebook transparency score, or like even Twitter's number in that case, like they'll say that 5% of MOUs are fake accounts, or something similar, right? So it's always like about what's the total like bad content or bad actions out there. There's always like prevalency, proactive mitigation, and then there is the total number of actions. Is the three metrics that I think all leaders will get, that hey, like in our entire platform, X% was like bad actions or like things you don't want. So I think it gives like some of these like public reports gives the industry like KPIs to measure against, because you can always measure your own KPIs, but it's always good to measure against like an industry standard. So I think it's a good first step that these pioneers have taken to kind of like bring consistency in the industry. And then more and more people are now like creating their own transparency reports, or like creating public portals where they share some of this information. So once you share like any of those KPIs, it's best to stick to them, show how those KPIs have moved. Hopefully, if you're investing in your trust and safety teams, like they move lower, and then you're able to like make your platform like safer as time goes. But that's sort of like the framework you operate in, is that like share your top KPIs with leadership often and like maintain them. use like industry numbers that like you can like compare yourself to industry to figure out like what is this number. If you like, it was 42%, like no one really knows like is 42% like good, bad, like is it what's expected. So unless you can say that hey, like it was 45 last year, or you can say that hey, like a comparative company is like at 49, so we're better than them. Unless you create those reference points of either like time or a comparator, and then essentially like that's where you make the number meaningful. So I feel like those are like some key takeaways in terms of like KPI design. It's always hard. I think the holy grail is always ROI. If anyone can create like a metric where say every dollar invested in trust and safety, you get like more than $1 worth of like ROI because of it. Like that's the holy grail. Like leaders will keep investing till that like ROI is 1-to-1. And that's how like most companies operate, right? If your ROI is like positive, then keep investing your dollar there. It's always like really hard to do, but I've seen like some stabs at it. You'll never be precise, but you'll be close. And I feel like that's where like trust and safety analytics teams are moving, is to create these like ROI metrics.
That's a really good point. I was just thinking about what you were saying about Uber safety report, but and you might not have, if they're just starting to create a team and starting to track, the volume of issues that they're responding to, you might not have that data ahead because you're just starting to collect that. But once you do, I think, set yourself up so you can track that. And so you could track, there's a number of different ways you could do that. So if you have like total amount of customer support tickets, how many tickets do you get that are just specific to trust and safety? Or if you, depending on what your service provides, maybe your marketplace, total amount of items posted versus how many trust and safety issues result from that. And so as you start to collect those numbers and track, like make sure you're set up with a tracking system that you can pull that in and look at these dashboards frequently and see where the trends are. It's interesting because trust and safety doesn't usually have respond to some of the more similar spikes that maybe could spike support volume or other volume. It's usually not impacted by like a bug. You're not going to typically see a ton of trust and safety issues because of an outage or something like that. But you will see trust and safety growing steadily with the growth of the platform, but it should be, it should be at scale. So you're seeing spikes at certain times or intervals of your growth. That might tell you something, is like, did something change? Did a process change? Do you put a new feature out, which is creating more people to reach out? And so those, I think, are metrics that are really interesting to the company too, to talk about like, hey, and then once you make a change to a policy, you can measure the impact of it. Are you seeing less cases in a certain area? Are you seeing, quicker resolution times? And I think those all paint the story or tell the story about, what your team is doing and how they're actually reducing the amount of issues that might come to the team later.
So plus 100 to that, like measure all data, like do not measure data. Like even if you don't have like a team or like a case in mind, like have the dashboards ready, like create the trend lines. It'll always be useful, if not today, like 5 years later, when you like either want to like do more like proactive analytics or like train models on. Like if you don't have the data, like you can't do that and you're like years behind. So I think like plus one to Stephanie said, like start measurement like day one. Even if analytics teams are not like part of your trust and safety teams, ask them to measure all of your measures as well, like prioritize them.
And when you guys think of measuring success, right, these are KPIs that can be kind of widely applied across marketplaces and social media companies. Were there any differences you noticed across, in KPIs across different verticals? I know, Abhay, you've spent some time at Facebook. Stephanie, you've been at Eventbrite. What do you guys think in terms of those patterns or differences?
I can take a first stab at it. Like just I'd say like the best way to look at it is like looking at the publicly available data and like seeing like what are the differences between what they measure. Is always like, so every company will have their own kind of like things they care about. And every platform, at least like I think I'm speaking more towards like online platforms right now, but I think most online platforms have a certain like target set, certain domain or category that they operate in, and and kind of like the risk between categories itself is like so large that probably you don't want to measure the same KPIs. So like probably like Uber and Thumbtack, like probably not the same KPIs. Like social media versus marketplace is probably not the same KPIs. So I think the first thing to do is like get like the closest like publicly available like KPI sheet, like some company which is like publicly shared it, and then try to figure out like are like each KPI like doesn't make sense to me, and then you probably like shortlist some KPIs which make sense, and then say like what are these numbers not capturing, and like what is important to leadership. I think those two questions like answer how you can tailor your KPIs to your business. Because what I've realized after working like many trust and safety like departments and companies is like no one is measuring the same thing. Everyone has their own way of measuring something, their own thing they care about. Because even the top line companies, even outside of trust and safety, some of these measures are like not standardized. So I'd say like always tailor it based on your business. Like that'll give you the most buy-in when you go to your leadership, because you're talking in their language. Like the KPIs that like leadership is looking at, if you can like find a way to map KPIs to those KPIs, and that's the way you'll win buy-in. But it's always like it's super tailor-made. Like you start with like publicly available data, and then you see what's important to your business.
Yeah, I think I completely agree. I don't even know that I have too much more to add. I think, but similarly to kind of what we were talking about before, I think try and identify, like Abhay said, like what is one use case or one issue that you know is like really prevalent that maybe is preventing people from posting like more events or posting jobs, whatever it might be that your platform hosts. Is there one thing that is maybe maybe more likely to churn, and then focus on how you can drive that and like measure a decrease in that. And I think, you know, Uber did this. I know Lyft did this in their transparency report, but if they're, you know, it's not really enough to just say like, hey, this is how many incidents we have. That doesn't tell the story. So trying to make it so it's more of like a metric to be able to say, hey, so if we had X rides on the platform over, this is how many times something was reported, that number could get a lot smaller, and it's more relevant to say like, hey, maybe 0.0009% of rides end with something being reported. That still doesn't tell like the full story, because there's so many different things that could include if you're just looking at a theme at that size. So I think internally with your company, if you try and focus on like, hey, this is something that we're seeing, or we know that our customers are talking about it, we know we need to reduce this. How can we track and measure, you know, the reduction of either these reports or even just how often this happens? And I think, you know, one thing that, or roadblock that you know, I've ran into multiple times is a lot of it is, you know, there's certain features that I think you guys will really want to advocate for to help track that, but it's really only applicable maybe to trust and safety. And so it might be hard to get the resources or the data or the features released so you could start tracking it. But don't get discouraged. I think, you know, try it, even if it, you know, seems impossible to solve. There might be a data or a data piece that you're overlooking that could help you, or there might be, you know, a process that you haven't reviewed. And so definitely make sure that, you know, at least in the beginning, that you're as in the work as you can be, and you're talking to the specialists who are resolving it and understanding like, what does that process look like? How long is it taking for them to really resolve something? And is there anything we could do to either speed that up so we have quicker resolutions but keep that same type of quality with that score? I think there's those are really more specific to just the team and the individual, but eventually over time, I think that it paints a really good picture about, hey, how often, you know, with these, we're not gonna be able to prevent everything from happening on a platform. That's just, you know, it's very challenging to do. I think it's a lofty goal that's good to have, but it's going to be really challenging challenging. And so if you think about it in a way where like we're not going to prevent everything, but how can we react really well in the moment? How do we make sure we give our teams the support they need to react and respond correctly? And how do we give them the tools, and what tools would be most valuable to them for handling these? I think, we're just starting to get our proactive side set up. Proactive meaning we're trying to, using Unit 21, we're going to try and surface alerts that might be relevant to a trust and safety team of something they can investigate. So not relying on a customer to reach out to you, and thinking about like proactive versus reactive, starting to measure like, hey, are we starting to see a reduction in cases because we're getting to them earlier? And I think that could be a really good compelling story to highlight if you are bringing in stakeholders frequently, like Abhay said, or collaborating or sending out recaps about the success. While you might not have some traditional metrics to cover, you focus on one area and try and show how what the steps you're taking is either decreasing that or increasing it, depending on what you want to see. I think that you'll start to be able to make sure that you're tracking and all the things that you're doing internally. You'll start to see those. You'll start to see it actually working, which is pretty exciting.
No, absolutely. Like if you don't measure your reactive world, then you can't make a case for a proactive team.
Right. And so reflecting back on this process, either at your current companies or in your past lives as well, what would you do differently, if anything, and what advice do you have for companies or teams that are maybe just starting out building a trust and safety practice?
I think, Abhay said on this a lot too. It's an ever evolving industry, and so I think it's tough. It's a tough industry to kind of be in, because you do have to, you're there, you're really needed, and you have a really important work, but you're not always going to be celebrated in terms of what you're working on, because a lot of the time it's like, hey, you're there as a preventative measure, but also a reactive, and the types of issues that you're usually working on are very that can get really escalated and complex. And so I think there's a ton of stuff that I would do differently, knowing what I know, but also I think even going back to what we were talking about, like, this is a relatively new industry. This is a new thing that we're seeing needed, and it's going to look very different depending on what your marketplace or what your use case is and what you're trying to work on. And so I think the biggest advice I would give is just to make sure that you're checking in frequently, but you're also taking care of the individuals who are working with those day to day. It's really important. I think this is an industry that is prone for burnout just because of the types of issues that we kind of rely on our specialists or analysts to resolve. And some of them, they're not always going to be able to do that. We're going to be learning constantly. And so I think making sure that you have a support system for those teams, and that you're investing in your staff in a way for longevity, and because it's industry is not for everyone, but the people who end up succeeding usually do really well. They're very passionate about what they do, and I think if they don't feel that support, or they don't feel like from the company that like they understand how important the work is, it's sometimes like a thankless job. And I think you'll find that you're churning a lot of people, or you're getting to the point where you're just having to constantly hire. And it's much easier if you get the system and the structure set up ahead of time to take care of them, whether that's making sure that they're taking the PTO that they need, making sure that you're staffed if you can be, and not trying to avoid some advocating for product needs or tools that will help the team, because it will make their lives a lot easier. And there's only so many times you could throw people at a problem like this because the work tends to be so complex.
Yeah, plus one to everything that Stephanie said. I think especially the burnout piece. When I started in, like, I just didn't know. But then I saw like a lot of my peers get really jaded by like working these incidents, and the ones that survive, I think like the ones who continue to be in the industry, I think are really like mission focused. They really see the meaning in the work they do. I think like that was one differentiator. But now I think like all companies have changed the way they hire as well. I think retention is really key. The longer the tenure of your trust and safety team is, like the next time a crisis happens, like the better position they'll be to kind of like get through the other side quicker, faster, cleaner. So I think like keeping folks engaged is like I think much more recognized now than like when I first started. Keeping them engaged, like keeping them like up to date with industry standards as well. Like we recently joined like the TSPA. We attend the Marketplace Risk Conference. I think like all of these are like avenues where you can like find like-minded people. You can like find people in the same industry might be dealing with the same kind of issues. Having a sounding board outside of the team also helps. Both like enrich yourself and like what's happening in industry, as well as kind of like finding the right like problems to go after. I think those are some new things. Like having an industry board really helps, or like an industry like association really helps. It solidifies the knowledge. It validates like some of these teams. So the next time like another company like is like thinking about like, oh, should a separate like department exist or not? I think these all like form cases to say that yes, you should probably like invest in this for the long term. So I think the industry is like maturing for the better. I do think like in the future, like there might be like the courses don't exist, but I have a feeling like over the next like 5 to 10 years, like you'll see like some courses aimed at trust and safety professionals, which I think like is always like good for the industry, good for all teams.
Totally agree. I know we want to leave some time at the end for questions. I was just going to add, I think, to what you were saying is think about, what type of training your team would need, and is there specialists in the space that are industry leaders that maybe you could partner with to provide that training and support to the team. I think, as Abhay said, this is never going to be one of those teams where you kind of just set it and forget it. Most teams aren't like that, but it's not going to be where it's like, hey, once they're trained, they're fully trained and they'll never have to go back to that. I think this is an industry where you want to make sure that you keep investing in your staff and you're investing in the people that are working on this and having them develop their skills, because they'll feel more confident, they'll feel better about what they're doing if they have the necessary skills. And so think about what that might be, whether that's, to Abhay's point, maybe connecting them with like-minded individuals in the space, identifying like a routine training to do, or maybe even just coordinating collaborations or with other teams and at the company internally to go over like specific cases and like learn from each other. I think that the interconnectedness and how connected your teams feel to the people that they work with and the company, that will make sure, I think, keep them as engaged and make sure that they understand what they're working for.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, thank you both so much for such thought out responses. And I think in the last 7 minutes that we have, we're going to open it up to any questions from the audience. So Andrea, should we just have people pop them in the question box?
Yeah, that would be great. Right now I don't have any others. If you guys want to go with some final remarks and give everyone a moment to submit.
I don't know that I have any final remarks.
Yeah, my final remark is like invest in your trust and safety teams. It is there is a good ROI, like do it.
Mm-hmm. I'll plus one to that, and the teams, and I think the tools, it'll be really apparent. Then they usually, like obviously the ROI, they'll usually pay for themselves within a couple of years if you end up doing it right, because you're ultimately going to be decreasing some of the more painful issues on the platform.
One closing word might also be to like attend like some of these like industry events. I think like has been helpful for me to find like people who are in the same situation or in the same domain, bounce ideas off of, and also like find what's working for them. So I think in the industry, like because everyone is focused on safety, I think there's a lot more like sharing of knowledge between people who work in the industry, just to like no one wants to like hoard safety technology. Everyone is like very collaborative and supportive, especially in this biz.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially, I still reach out to my colleagues, both of Abhay and Lyft, and just, pick their brains about stuff that we're working on, and to hear like, hey, I know that they've dealt with it. Especially Lyft is a lot bigger than Wonolo, where I'm currently working now, and has had their safety team set up for a while, and just, develop those connections. I think that you learn from each other, and, learn best practices, and don't be afraid to reach out. I think a lot of the times, trust and safety, we try and kind of keep it in a little black box, which makes sense because it is a very, these are, sometimes very sensitive, escalated situations that you want to make sure you handle right. You don't necessarily want to broadcast that, but even without broadcasting it, making sure that you're, not preventing yourself from checking in with people who might have advice or other skills, or you can talk through like how they've handled situations in the past. We don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. Like if you keep yourself siloed, it's a lot harder to learn.
Awesome. It doesn't look like we have any questions. So Abhay, Stephanie, if there isn't anything else, it was great hosting this webinar with you guys. And thanks Andrea and Marketplace Risk team as well for organizing.
+1. Thanks everyone for joining, and thanks Priya and Abhay for co-hosting this with me. This was great. And yeah, thank you guys so much.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and I hope you have a great day.
Yes.
As well. Thank you.